Good morning, everybody, and welcome to what we're hoping to be our last online service. Starting next Sunday, September the 13th, we're actually relaunching live services at our new location, 131 Colby Drive, and we sure hope you can make it out. This next Sunday, the 13th, though, it's not going to be a regular service. It's more like a kickoff and a engaging together. It's a come and go, how are you doing barbecue. And so we invite you to come. It's at 5 o'clock. But we'd ask you to register first at info at lifebridge.ca. That's our email address, and you can get all the information right here on our website at lifebridge.ca. However, today, as I said, is our last online message, and we're going to be looking at the book of Acts, Acts chapter 1, verse 8 most specifically. And we're going to be answering the question, just what is a Christian supposed to do? Let me ask you a question as we begin this. Have you ever found yourself starting a new job or beginning a new project? Maybe it's around the house or you're trying out a new recipe, only to find that you weren't clear on what you were supposed to do, or you weren't certain what the ingredient quotient was supposed to be for those tasty cookies. I mean, it could be that you didn't ask enough clarifying questions, or it might be that the instructions on the package weren't well defined. Maybe the recipe given to you or the job description just wasn't clear. Or it could be that your employer just hadn't taken the time to explain what was expected. Or maybe with those tasty cookies, your mom simply assumed that you knew how much salt to use. Now, for those of you who have never been in a situation like that, just ask the person who has had such an experience. And let me tell you, it's horrid. I was about 16 years of age when I took a summer job working with a landscaper. I actually enjoyed my job, except for the one day that he dropped me off on my own. What he did was he dumped a pile of this foreign-looking tools on the grass and gave me very unclear instructions. You know, instructions to mow the grass, but not the grass where the circumference of the earth meets the final longitude of Venus. I mean, at least that's kind of sort of how I heard it. Anyways, and trim the green hedges. Just the shamrock green, definitely not the hemlock green ones. You know what? To this day, I just cannot tell the difference between those two greens. And for that matter, who knew that there was more than one green? Listen, if you didn't know, there is, because I checked this out. There's apple, there's aquamarine, there's beryl, chartreuse, didn't even know that was a word. There's emerald, fir, forest, grass green, jade, Kelly green, lawn green, leaf green, lime, mint, moss, olive drab, pea green, pine, sage, sap, sea green, seafoam, spring green, viridian, and then of course the famous shamrock and hemlock green. I mean, actually, when I Googled it, I learned that there were 295 different types of green. Who knew? Listen, if you're ever a contestant on the game show Jeopardy and that's an answer, you're welcome. Oh, and he also wanted me to only weed by the sword fern and the nodding onion plants. Really? Like I knew about tulips, and I was just discovering that roses came in more colors than red. I was supposed to know what those flowers or vegetables or whatever they are were? Then, before any questions could be asked, I probably wouldn't have asked any anyways, being 16 years old, he left. Just what's a guy supposed to do? Without a clear job description, I have to tell you, I was lost. I was directionless. In fact, I kind of felt a little purposeless. That's not a great place to be when you want to do a good job. Well, I did the best that I could, and I did what I hoped would be right. Eventually, my boss came back, and he took one look at what I didn't do, and by the look on his face, I immediately knew I wouldn't be hearing the words, "Well done." But I did know that from that day forward, I would never, ever hesitate to ask clarifying questions when it came to the expectations of my job. Listen, I needed a clear job description, and without it, I failed to meet up to the expectations of my boss. Having a clear job description is absolutely important. I think we could all agree on that. But having a clear job description is important in the Christian life as well. Yet too often, I think, many don't seem to know what a Christian is supposed to do while we're here on good old planet Earth. Now, over the years, I've heard a question or one like it from people in the church. just what's a Christian supposed to do? Once we make the decision to follow Jesus, what's next? Well, of course, we know we get baptized, or we pick up a Bible plan, or we join a life group. But really, is that what we're supposed to do? Now, some of us feel guilty because we're not maybe living out in the streets like a Mother Teresa, giving up all our earthly goods, or we feel shame deep inside of us because we're not like Billy Graham, bringing hundreds, if not thousands, to Christ every month that we breathe. Now, that might be something that you may be called to do or to be a part of. But is that the general job description for all followers of Christ? Then on the other side, we might assume that a disciple doesn't need to do a thing, arguing, you know what, that we're not involved in a works-based faith, which, by the way, is actually true. But sometimes what we'll do is we'll use the first part of the verse from Psalm 46:10 that says, "Be still and know that I am God." And we're using it as our life verse, even while forgetting that there's much more to the context. I mean, just be, we say. The Holy Spirit's going to do the rest. And after all, let's not get in the way of God's work. Just sit back and enjoy the summer days of our faith experience. Okay, well, back to the original question. What's a Christian supposed to do? What if we could know clearly what a disciple is supposed to do? Now, I'm not talking about activities in the church, or about joining a life group, or reading your Bible, or getting baptized, or learning how to pray, or going to a spiritual gifts class. I mean, those things are great things to do, and certainly to be a part of. However, what I'm talking about is living every day in such a way that when Jesus returns, he'll look at how you and I are living out our lives, and he will say, "Well done." Now, to be clear, I'm not talking about a way to earn your salvation. You can't earn your salvation. Jesus freely offers that to us. But what I'm talking about is, once we're a child of the King, what is the kid of the King supposed to do next? If you knew what was expected of you at that point, would it make a difference in how you live today? Would it change how you go about living the Christian life that you've already been living? And if we knew what to do next, would that make a difference in our sense of purpose? And for that matter, would it actually give us a purpose? Here's the thing. We can know what to do. In fact, once we see it, we'll wonder how we ever missed it. And listen, church, once we see it, we can't unsee it. And then that means we're going to have to make a choice of one of two things. One, we can dismiss it, and so then we become disobedient of Jesus' instructions to us, or we obey and embrace a purpose for which we have been recreated for in our new birth. A purpose that is so much bigger and better than anything we or this whole world could ever hope to be a part of apart from Jesus. Now, the great thing is that we do have a very clear job description, and is found in Acts 1:8. Jesus, our heavenly boss, has commissioned us with a task much more important than pulling weeds. Our job is to go out into all the world to be his witnesses. Now, the question is, will he need to be asking us, why aren't you doing what I commissioned you to do? Or will he be able to say, well done? Well, let's take a look at Acts chapter 1, and we're going to start at verse 6. So when the apostles were with Jesus, they kept asking him, Lord, has the time come for you to free Israel and restore our kingdom? He replied, the Father alone has the authority to set those dates and times, and they are not for you to know. But you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you, and you will be my witnesses, telling people about me everywhere in Jerusalem, throughout Judea, in Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. After saying this, he was taken up into a cloud while they were watching, and they could no longer see him. Now, to help us really understand just what is being said here, I think it would be helpful for us all to receive a little bit of a history lesson. Let's go down a history storyline, because I think this will help with the passage in its proper perspective and context. Now, typically, the story of Israel begins with God's covenant with Abraham. That happened approximately about 2000 BC. And you can read about that in Genesis. In fact, Genesis 12:2, God said to Abraham, I will make you into a great nation. Ever since then, the Israelite nation have always referred back to that. Now, the name Israel itself, where did that come from? Well, the name Israel actually means one who fights victoriously with God. And it actually came from the new name that God gave Abraham's grandson, Jacob. This was after Jacob had endured and prevailed in a spiritual wrestling match with God at Jabbok, which you can read about in Genesis 32, and that's where the name Israel comes from. Now, it's at this point that the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, then from then on, are often referred to as the children of Israel. Now, interestingly enough, and I think it's important to note, that God's choice of Israel as his chosen people didn't lie in any special size or nature or attraction of the nation. Actually, the nation of Israel was considered the runt of the litter as far as nations go among all other nations around at the time. Israel was then, and is in fact today, a little country not more than 22,000 square kilometers. Nova Scotia, to put it by comparison, is just over 55,000 square kilometers. I mean, you could fit two Israels into our province with room to spare. Now, for our American friends, you could fit more than 8 Israels into Washington state. Now, God chose these people not because they were better or brighter or bolder or bigger than anyone else, but simply because of his love for them and because of his unconditional covenant that he had made with Abraham, as I had mentioned earlier already back in Genesis. This doesn't mean that God loved Israel more than other people. It was just that, you see, he intended to use Israel as his means to love and to bless everyone else. In fact, it was God's plan right from the very beginning to bring forth the Messiah through Israel to act as the Savior for the entire world, not just Israel. So beginning as a unilateral promise to one man, Abraham, the children of Israel rely now and look back at that promise, and they would hold on to that promise even during a significant period of slavery in Egypt. Then, by means of an amazing series of miraculous events, God delivers the Israelites out of Egypt in what is called now the Exodus. The Exodus is the act of deliverance which Israelites see as the demonstration of God's love and his protection of Israel. Now, once the Exodus was completed, God established a conditional covenant with the Israelites at a place called Mount Sinai. And it's there that God proclaimed his law, which we all know now as the Ten Commandments. And it is there at Mount Sinai that God promises blessings for adherence to his law and curses for non-compliance. Now, the rest of Israel's history as recorded in the Bible is a continuing cycle of blessing and punishment for Israel's obedience and disobedience to God's law. I mean, throughout times of victory and defeat, kings and judges, priests and prophets, restoration and exile, the Israelites are blessed when they obey God, and they're disciplined when they do not. So it was only natural then that the Jews were always vividly conscious of being God's chosen people. But they misunderstood God's plan that the world was to be blessed through them. Instead, because of their story of God's direct interaction and action with them throughout their history, they took that to mean that they were inevitably destined for special honor and special privileges and for worldwide domination. Rome should not have been the worldwide power of Jesus' day. It should be us. And that would have been a very common thought among the people. Now, granted, Israel had seen its share of independence, but it always seemed to come under the rule at different times to somebody else. I mean, other nations conquered them at various times along the timeline of history. Empires like the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, and the Romans. So what happened was that the Jews, they just got tired of that, obviously, and they began to look forward to a day when the world sovereignty that they had dreamed of and they felt was promised to them would actually be theirs. Now, as we begin to understand the history of these people, we can then, I think, begin to appreciate their point of view, to understand their hopes, and to even empathize with them over their confusion with the message that Jesus was giving them. Jesus preached that the kingdom of God was at hand. Now, the trouble was that he meant one thing, while his listeners thought it meant something completely else. So now, when the disciples kept asking him, Lord, is the time come for you to free Israel and to restore your kingdom? We know that they were looking for a political kingdom. But Jesus meant a spiritual kingdom founded on love. And it was to this kingdom that he gave the clear job description of being his witnesses. Now, before we move on, I think it's important to understand just what a witness is. So, What is a witness? Well, firstly, a witness is someone who understands the mission. To the Jewish mind, they knew that they were the center of God's plan. They were a special people with whom God had established a covenant relationship, and they knew that the world was to be blessed through them. I mean, they couldn't miss that. It was written very clearly in black and white in the scriptures, after all. But it's what they believed and expected it to mean that caught them up and tripped them up. They thought it meant that they would rule the world. They also assumed that every other nation would welcome that as a blessing because they would eventually come to realize that it was God's plan for the natural order of things, and they would all fall in line. See, the Jewish mindset was that the nations of the earth would welcome with joy, even slavery, once the Messiah established his rightful rule over the earth. Their eyes would be open, they would see it, and they would say, this is the right way of things. But alas, they misinterpreted and misunderstood, and for that matter, assumed on some very important points. Listen, we all know intentions and expectations and words are very important. We all know that we can misunderstand intentions and expectations with each other all the time, even if we think we've been crystal clear. Listen, if you've been married for more than 5 weeks, you know that. For those of us who have kids, or for that matter have ever been a kid, or are currently a kid, a simple instruction of clean your room can have a number of different interpretations, can't it? I remember seeing a comic strip where a guy is standing at the front porch of another man holding a paint can, and he's telling this man, as after knocking on the door, that he has just finished painting his brand new Porsche parked out in the driveway, to which the man who obviously owns the car shouts, "I said paint the porch." Communication is a tricky business, isn't it? Even at the best of times. That's why when Jesus gives us a job, it's vitally important to understand what the mission he gave us really is. Instead of understanding that they were to be a blessing to the whole world, Israel's sense of mission became a narrow self-focus. It's kind of like a national navel gaze, summed up in their nation's separation from all other nations and its concentration on the holy city, Jerusalem, and the holy temple within the city of Jerusalem, and the Holy of Holies within that temple in the center of the holy city, Jerusalem. The understanding was that if the world was to be blessed through them, that meant then that the world would have to come to them for that to happen. To that point, there weren't any Jewish missionaries. I mean, there was no need. If somebody was to find salvation, to receive the blessing of the covenant, they would need to come to Israel and become a Jew. You see, all movement was toward the center. There would have been little to no concept of God moving away from that center and beyond those boundaries. In fact, the faithful Jew would even need to come from the far reaches of the world in order to experience the festivals of faith and to share in the nation's religion. To move away from that center and to move beyond the boundaries of the faith experience would not have been understood as making sense. I mean, out there, we would be made unclean. It's not pure out there. That is why the religious leaders of the time could never get Jesus and his fascination with associating with sinners. I mean, that to them was a moving away from the pure center. It was a dirty world out there, and if you got involved with those people and that world, it could only make you dirty. Playing in the mud results in you becoming muddy. Hanging with a sinner results in you becoming a sinner. That is why they called Jesus a glutton and a drunkard and a sinner, because in their minds it stood to reason that if he touched the dirt, then he must be dirty. Going out from the center meant that you would be made dirty. So I think then, as we begin to understand that mindset, we can imagine the disciples' confusion when Jesus, in answer to their question, commissioned them with the job of being his witnesses. Really saying that they are now to begin moving away from that safe center they've always held strong to. And this is why it is so important then, I think, for a witness to understand his or her mission. You see, if Jesus had not clarified the mission, Christianity would never have become a blessing to billions. Instead, it would have remained a minor cult of Judaism in a backwater country, if it had survived at all. So the question I think we need to be asking ourselves is, do I understand the mission? Well, to help us answer that question, let's move on to the second point. A witness is someone who knows the true story, and knows the true story because he or she has personally experienced the story themselves. Now, in a court of law, a person cannot give in evidence a secondhand story. It must be a personal experience. I mean, for example, I can't say, well, I heard from my buddy Kent that so-and-so shot the gun. I mean, if I tried that in our courts, I would be dismissed as a witness. I couldn't be a witness. I would have had to have personally seen, personally experienced the individual shooting the gun. So now, when Jesus sends us out as his witnesses, he sends us to be witnesses to the transforming power of Jesus Christ in our own lives. That's what Jesus meant by telling the disciples that they'd be his witnesses. They were to give testimony of a very real personal experience of a radical life-altering change that happened to them and in them. We are all to be witnesses of Christ living through us, and others seeing Jesus in action by how we live and by how we love. That's why Jesus said in John 13:35, by this all men will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. You see, it's by loving one another that we are witnesses of Jesus' transforming power, that we show the world that we are changed. That's why the gospel is the only real hope against racism, church. The power of the gospel changes us so dramatically into new creations, into the image of Jesus Christ, so that we can't help but love like Jesus. And when we love like Jesus, racism finds no home. The gospel is the answer, but only when we have personally experienced the transforming power of that very gospel. The story goes that H.M. Stanley discovered David Livingstone in the 1800s in Central Africa. And when he had spent some time with him, he said, if I had been with him any longer, I would have been compelled to be a Christian, and he never spoke to me at all about it. Listen, the weight of the witness of this man's life was irresistible, but it was only possible because Livingstone had experienced the transforming power of the gospel in his own life. You see, it was personal. It was real. We, you and I, as disciples of Jesus Christ, have been called to be his witnesses to such an extent that when others see the power of God in our lives and the change that has been made, when they see his fingerprints all over us, they can't help but witness his presence. There's a quote that is often used, wrongfully attributed to Francis of Assisi. Preach the gospel at all times, and when necessary, use words. I really, really dislike that quote, or at least the way it's used, because it's intended to say that proclaiming the gospel by example is more virtuous than actually proclaiming with voice. The truth is, proclaiming the gospel is a both and. We live it out and speak it out. As Peter says in 1 Peter 3:15, always be ready to give an answer to anyone who asks you of the hope that you have. The picture we have here is that people ask because they see something that is very personal being experienced in our lives. Something transformative is at work. And they see that we live the change. But then we answer with words, and we can answer with authority because we personally experienced the gospel power. We personally experienced the story. So, a witness understands the mission, and a witness tells others about the truth of what has happened to them and in them, their personal experience. But also, as witnesses who understand the mission we're sent on, we do so knowing that we're called to be martyrs. But we go anyways. In fact, we go joyfully. Now, the Greek word for witness and the word for martyr is actually the same word, martas. A witness has to be ready, in other words, to become a martyr. Now, there is a spiritual concept here of dying to self, and all of us have been called to be martyrs. We die to self. We need to die to self in order to be made truly alive in Jesus Christ. In fact, my personal mission statement is dying to know Christ, living to make him known. As Jesus' witnesses, we have died to our own mission. We are now living his mission. Hope that makes sense. But there's also a physical understanding here too. In fact, we may find a day where we must give up our very real physical lives for the gospel. I think that we need to consider that a very real possibility one day. Now, it might not be in our lifetimes, but history repeats itself. And martyrdom was the reality of the early church. In fact, outside of the Western world, martyrdom is very real even today. There have been thousands of Christians martyred for the gospel in the past year alone, since the beginning of 2020. Now, I'm not trying to frighten you, but we need to know the truth. Martyrdom is real. However, in our North American context, martyrdom probably won't mean death, but in the very least, it may mean to be made uncomfortable. How comfortable are we in our Christian world? And I wonder sometimes if we might be too comfortable. And if that's true, we should be asking just what uncomfortable looks like. Now, we had the Jewish history lesson already, so understanding the disciples' mindset, let's look at Acts 1:8 again. But you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you, and you'll be my witnesses, telling people about me everywhere, in Jerusalem, throughout Judea and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. Jesus is here telling the disciples to lead a mission that would move from Jerusalem to the ends of the earth. The old idea that all the nations needed to come to the center, to Jerusalem, to be saved is no longer the way. The direction is now changed. The ends of the earth represented going to the unclean peoples outside of Judaism, out to where the savages lived. That means then that the walls of separation are going to have to be dismantled. The man-made boundaries will now be breached with a message that just can't be contained within any one particular culture. The gospel is to go not only to the Jews, but also to the Samaritans, which was shock enough, but also to the Gentiles, to that vast population that, according to the Jewish view, was rejected because they were not chosen, they were impure, they were very unclean. The disciples were Jews, and they had derived their identity from the great tradition of their people's faith. Their sensibilities and attitudes have been molded by that very tradition. They couldn't easily move out of that conditioning. They couldn't have truly understood what Jesus meant by the ends of the earth. Not at that time anyways. In fact, they were going to have to experience some traumatic challenges to their sense of identity. One of those challenges and changes of conditioning came to Peter later in chapter 10 of Acts. Peter goes to the rooftop to pray, and there he receives a vision. Now let's read that, starting in verse 11. He saw heaven opened and something like a large sheet being let down to earth by its four corners. It contained all kinds of four-footed animals, as well as reptiles of the earth and birds of the air. Then a voice told him, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." "Surely not, Lord," Peter replied. "I have never eaten anything impure or unclean." The voice spoke to him a second time. "Do not call anything impure that God has made clean." This happened 3 times, and immediately the sheet was taken back up to heaven. Now, Peter obviously was at first horrified because he saw on that sheet all kinds of critters that he had been raised to understand were unclean, culturally unacceptable to eat, and things like lobster and bacon and pork and all those kinds of things like that. To the Jewish mind, that those were unclean. Peter was confused, and he was unsure of what this vision meant. In fact, it says later in verses 17 and 19 of the same chapter that he was thinking and he was processing about the vision when the 2 men who had been sent to see him came and knocked on the door. And then finally, later on in verses 27 and 29 of the same chapter, Peter declares it that though the Jewish law prohibits him from associating and visiting with a Gentile, that's all changed. The vision that Peter had was about the elimination of these man-made barriers. He was no longer to be afraid of associating with those who do not participate, or who rather do participate, in eating unclean foods, of visiting with those whose cultures are completely different from a good old Jewish boy. And God was saying, Peter, don't wait until they're all cleaned up. You're not going to be dishonoring me. I want you to go out to them, and I want you to risk looking dirty. Church, we all need to be willing to be uncomfortable for the mission. The vision Peter received radically changed his cultural ideal from alienating others in order to protect the purity of his faith to accepting others for who they are and where they're at. And that was unheard of in the Jewish worldview of the day. Well, you know what? I'm going to throw out a challenge out at all of us. I sometimes wonder if we being modern Christianity, have reverted back to Israel's sense of mission, where it's all centered inward. We want to protect our purity, and so we demand or at least suggest that the world conform to our moral worldview, to enter our center, as it were. They must either change or clean up, or we're not going to associate with them. We Christians, now I'm saying this in general, in a general sweep, because I know that not all of Christianity has done this, but I think we need to be taking a good, long, hard look at ourselves to see if we have been guilty of some or all of these approaches. I know I have, and that's why I'm sharing what I've learned and I've experienced with you. I think sometimes we Christians, though, have been guilty of expecting non-Christians to act like Christians, even though they're not. To have the same values as Christ followers. In fact, I'm sure you've seen some social media postings where Christ followers have gotten into arguments with non-Christians about their choices, and have even gotten angry at them for living and thinking like a non-Christian. Now, here's a mind blower for you. Poof. You can't expect non-Christians to think and act like a Christian. You know why? It's because it takes the miracle of a new birth, a recreation, to see that happen. Sometimes I think we Christians seem more concerned about what the non-Christian world is up to than we do about our own spiritual hearts. Please listen to me. I'm not saying we don't engage in conversation about important matters. But what I am saying is to ask ourselves what our motivation and approach is when we do engage. Not unlike the Jewish mentality of Peter's day, sometimes I think we can focus inward instead of outward and be completely happy with our Christian celebrations, with all of our Christian friends, all dressed up nicely in our Christian accepted clothing while eating our Christian accepted foods, talking to each other in our acceptable Christian language, while in the background we listen to our Christian acceptable music. And it's like our life's vision statement is, we don't smoke and we don't chew and we don't associate with them that do. Because it is much too uncomfortable to leave our comfort zones and leave all that makes us feel right and good and warm and clean and take that chance that we might get dirty, or in the very least give that perception to some of our Christian buddies that we are dirty. Listen, I know it seems like I'm exaggerating, and I am a little bit, but I really want us to think about how we are treating Jesus' commission, the job that he has given us, to be his witnesses. We need to take to heart what Jesus told us in Acts 1:8. Go out into all the world as his witnesses. Well, in any job, the question is the same. Where do you start? Based on Acts 1:8, it seems that we're told and given that answer as well. A witness starts where they are at. Look again at Jesus' words where he says this, "And you will be my witnesses, telling people about me everywhere, in Jerusalem, throughout Judea, in Samaria, and to the ends of the earth." Jesus was saying here that a witness is to operate in this ever-extending series of circles away from the center and outward. First in Jerusalem, then throughout Judea, then Samaria, the semi-Jewish state, serving as I think kind of like a bridge to the Gentile peoples, and finally to the ultimate ends of the world. So I think we can ask ourselves the question, what is our Jerusalem in Judea? Well, I like to suggest that it's our family, our friends, our co-workers. That's our Jerusalem, and to some extent our Judea. You start with the people closest to you. And you don't have to go anywhere else first. You start with the people in your own sphere of influence. I mean, think about it. Many of them still need to hear the gospel power. Then Jesus says to go to Samaria. The Samaritans were culturally and ethnically different from the disciples. The next place you take the message is to people of a different culture, language, ethnic group than you. Do you know anybody who speaks a different language than you do? More and more we're seeing people of other cultures and religions and nations moving into our neighborhoods and workplaces. I mean, have you looked around Halifax lately? There are many immigrants moving here from other parts of the world. But it's not just other countries. What about white and black and First Nations right here at home? What about those who hold to differing political opinions, or who are on the opposite spectrum about moral issues, or from a different socio-economic bracket? My point is, you don't have to go very far to find your Samaria. It's right next door. We embrace them, and we engage with them, and we move out to where they are. Then Jesus says, go to the ends of the earth. Now, for hundreds and hundreds of years, most Christians anyways, couldn't obey that part, literally, because the ability to travel was extremely limited. But today, there are many opportunities for believers to go on short-term trips that lead them to the ends of the earth. We have a trip that had been planned, but because of COVID, to we weren't able to travel down to Honduras. But there are trips like that. Once COVID is under control, we'll be able to re-engage again. But that also doesn't even mean leaving Halifax. Not anymore. As we see the world come to us, are we watching for and seeing the opportunities that are around us in our own neighborhoods with the influx of peoples from around the globe? People all around us, church, need to hear the good news of Jesus Christ. They need to see the gospel power. That's because the gospel is the answer. It's the answer to racism. It's the answer to injustice. It's the answer to social ills, because it changes us, you see, from the inside out. Listen, church, wherever our daily lives takes us, or the leading of God directs us in and near the routine of our lives, that's our mission. So, what's a Christian supposed to do? In the end, we Christians are to know Jesus, love others, and make disciples as we go out as a people who understand our mission, because we've experienced a personal change in our lives, and so live lives that are dying. Where we're dying to self, willing to go and die for Christ, dying to know Him and living to make Him known. Church, that's what a Christian is supposed to do. Well, have a great week. You're loved.